I'm so pleased to have the privilege to lead us through this conversation today. And I wanted to open by just saying a few words of introduction of Dr. Matache, and then she'll say a bit about her book, and then we'll open it up for a broader conversation with you all. Also just a note that we have, this event is also being live streamed over Zoom, so we have additional participants who are joining us there. Dr. Matache is a lecturer on social and behavioral sciences at the Chan School of Public Health, and the co-founder and director of the Roma program at the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights here at Harvard. She is also a member of the Lancet Commission on Racism, Structural Discrimination, and Global Health. Dr. Matache's research focuses on the manifestations and impacts of racism and other systems of oppression in different geographical and political contexts. Her research examines the structural and social determinants of health and their nexus with historical context and contemporary public policies, with a particular focus on anti-Roma racism, which will be the focus of our conversation today. On a personal note, I first met Magda over Zoom during the pandemic when the International Human Rights Clinic, where I teach, was embarking on a project to support advocacy in favor of securing compensation for Roma communities who were poisoned by lead in Kosovo. And this is one of the most notorious, oh, sorry, can you hear okay? Oh, I'm so sorry. Sorry. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, great. And this is one of the most notorious examples of environmental racism faced by Roma communities in Europe. A problem that persists throughout the continent and to this day. In this particular case, the communities were displaced after the civil war in Kosovo, and they were housed in camps that were known to be so heavily contaminated by lead that they were deemed to be unfit for human habitation. And so because of this, they were meant to stay there for 45 to 60 days as an emergency measure. But in some cases, families ended up living there for over a decade, resulting in some of the worst lead poisoning ever recorded in history. And the effects of lead poisoning continue very much to this day. So after a 10-year legal battle to secure compensation from the UN, which was the de facto government in Kosovo at the time, the UN's own Human Rights Advisory Panel, a body established to determine the organization's human rights obligations in Kosovo, determined that they owed compensation to the victims of lead poisoning. Importantly, the panel also found that the actions towards this community and the failure to move them into safer housing was rooted in anti-Roma discrimination, an aspect of the case that is often overlooked. And I think this case is an example both of how anti-Roma racism contributes to human rights violations, but also how legal systems tend to replicate hegemonic structures that have subjugated Roma communities and in turn have failed to deliver justice. So some of the themes that we'll be exploring today. And throughout this work on advocating for justice for the affected communities, Magda has been both a resource and a mentor to myself and to other activists who have been engaging in the work, as we sought to do the work in a way that centers Roma voices and disrupts traditional dynamics between Gadio or non-Roma and Roma activists. And so I'm so pleased on a personal note to get to share the stage with Magda today. And with that, would like to turn it over to Magda to share with us about her work.
Thank you so much, Bea, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here today. And it's been a pleasure to work with you in the past few years and to have you as a partner in Kosovo, in an area where rarely we get support from big institutions and powerful institutions like Harvard. So I'm very grateful to you for that. And it's a privilege to speak about my book here today. So thank you so much, Bea, Abadir, and the law school, the EMR, and the partners. I want to use my time today to do two things. First, to provide a short overview of the book's main arguments, And second, to focus on one argument that may be more relevant for this group today, namely the limits of human rights and liberal laws and policies when they are used to address collective and enduring injustices. And I'll start with the first point because that one is shorter and clearer. So the broader argument of the permanence of anti-Roma racism is that the origins of anti-Roma racism are not to be found in ideologies, prejudice, discrimination, biases, but instead I place the roots of anti-Roma racism in two interconnected projects of land control and labor exploitation. When I talk about labor exploitation, I mean a racialized system of slavery in two territories in Europe, back then called Wallachia and Moldavia, two principalities, which are today territories of Romania, but also territories of Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova, but mostly Romania. And this system of racialized slavery lasted for 500 years, starting in the 1300s. And when I talk about land control, I'm thinking about the politics of killings, expulsions, hunts, and entry bans imposed on Romani people across Europe in the late Middle Ages and early modern periods. So these are the genesis of anti-Roma racism in the way in which I see them, and this changes a little bit the approach that we see in Europe, because very often Europeans, and here I talk about institutions and scholars, think about the roots of this form of racism in ideology, in Nazism, in the theories of race, and so much more. But I take a different approach where I don't think that prejudice and ideology is the roots, but actually there is a project in place. It can be exploitation, it can be control, it can be prestige, but there is an organized political project in place. Thus, I argue that this racism is structural, is enduring, and it's an adaptive technology of power. And exploitation control with these roots in European history. In the book, I introduced several conceptual notes which are rooted in our own language, Romani language, to take a little bit of distance from the Western thought, but also to adjust this conversation, this theory to our own realities and our own histories. So in the book, I talk about what I call oficialo tel giu di pen, which translates into a top-down oppression. So that's a structural form of racism that starts at the top, and we see manifestations around any area of work and life. And then I use the term gajones and the concept of gajones as a historically specific articulation of white privilege and power. And I use gajones, not whiteness, because in Europe there is a very specific hierarchy that has been created between white Europeans and Roma. So it's not between various categories of populations, but it's a very direct and distinct hierarchy. This book argues that this system of oppression transforms and has transformed, but also survives and has survived through what I call underpinnings and protectors. Essentially, what keeps this system in place across time. And I create several categories. They may not be the only ones, but this is what I come with, and I hope others would contribute as well. I talk about racialization and its counterpart, gajones, organized erasure, bodily violence, apartness, and I'll talk more about apartness today, looking specifically at school segregation, and gajikane, or white European politics and policy making. These underpinnings and protectors have continued, but have also transformed over time over political regimes and also over geographies. So we see different manifestations, different nuances of the same system of oppression across geographies, because we are talking about a global community of about 15 million Romani individuals, although the majority of Romani people are in Europe, particularly in Eastern and Central Europe. So this intervention with this book is not only historical, but is also political and is theoretical. So I try to place anti-Romani racism into these global theories and conversations and solidarity movements regarding racism or racisms, if we were to think about the various racisms that we encounter in the world, but also racialization, caste systems, slavery, structural oppression, and so on. And I insist that the Romani case is not marginal to these histories, realities, theories, and conversations, but it belongs within all of this. Today, I also want to move a little bit from history and political thought and address a question, one that is related more to justice and remedies. And I want to do that particularly because I want to get your feedback. I know that your specialization is different than mine. I'm a political scientist, but I'm thinking about these questions quite often. So essentially, if anti-Roma racism, as much as any other racism, is historical, enduring, and collective, what happens when states and institutions try to address it primarily to individual human rights, anti-discrimination, equality bodies, and social inclusion programs? My response in the book does not imply that human rights are insignificant. On the contrary, human rights, freedoms, legal protections, litigation, strategic litigation, which I've used a lot in my work back in Europe, and the rule of law matter a lot. But they are profoundly insufficient when the injustice itself is collective, is historically layered, and structurally and institutionally reproduced. So I critique the liberal frameworks and liberal democracy, arguing that these liberal frameworks treat anti-Roma racism as a matter of contemporary exclusion, of discrimination, of biases and prejudices, or poverty and lack of access to public services than human rights, right? But those things are real. I lived in Europe for more than 35 years before moving here in 2012, and I can attest to the reality of all these problems, and more so human rights violations. But that framing tends to detach present harms from the longer history that produced and reproduced them. So we do have slavery, we do have poverty in my own country, Romania. But can we connect it only to present-day inequities and inequality, or can we think also about its historical roots, meaning a 500 years of enslavement in that very territory? So I argue that when the problem is defined narrowly, and then the solution is also narrowed, and I think that this is what we see in the case of Europe, because the liberal frameworks, the human rights frameworks, work very well for individuals, and most often individuals who have one human rights violation happening this week may not have a full history of human rights violations, injustices, and oppression in the background. So I argue that we need to add another element to the human rights framework, and that element should be more structural in nature. And I'll probably add a few more thoughts, and I'll give you an example. And I think that one of the clearest places where we can think about this dichotomy is school segregation. And across Europe, school segregation has persisted for decades if we were to think only about democracy. But we can actually spot it in the 1800s in churches in in the UK, what is today UK, and in many other areas. So school segregation and segregation of children has been a matter ever since public education, and even before has been developed. But in the past few decades, I think that we see segregation persisting in spite of the fact that the European Union has a race directive that is very strong. We are proud of it. We have anti-discrimination laws in all EU countries, in all European Union countries, and we have many policy commitments and landmark litigation. And I'll talk a little bit about a few cases. But yet Romani children are separated into Roma-only classes, Roma-only schools, remedial schools, and more so special schools. So this is special education through a racialized misdiagnosis. So schools and authorities most often justify these arguments using what they think are neutral terms. Language deficiency of Romani children. They speak Romani language at home. They don't speak Croatian as well as Romani language. Parental preference, what you call here white flight. And then administrative necessity. That can be very broad. Schools can be very creative in finding some arguments. But in reality, these claims are racially coded terms and practices serving to justify, reinforce, and perpetuate school segregation. In the book, I talk about the European Court of Human Rights and some of the cases that were brought to court, including DH versus others and others versus the Czech Republic, and Orsos and others versus Croatia. These are two well-known cases of school segregation. One looks at special schools, the other one looks at language deficiency, or if you want to call it that way. At the same time, there are several domestic courts, including in Hungary, where courts have also rejected schools' reliance on white flight as a defense for segregation. However, even where these courts have a judgment and where courts intervene, formal desegregation often leave the structure intact. So nothing changes at the level of the systems. We can see some changes for the individuals who actually were part of the complaint in court. So these classrooms remain, under-resourced. The quality of education is very poor and so on. And more so, although we have all these, case law in various countries in Europe, in many countries in Europe, in 2021, the Fundamental Rights Agency, which is the research and more, part of the European Commission, they showed that from 2016, when they had another study to 2021, school segregation has increased in many countries in Europe, including the Czech Republic, where the famous case is, but also in my own country, we see school segregation increasing from 28% in 2016 to 51% in 2021. So legislation is important. Some of the plaintiffs in these cases received compensation, but when you have 50% of the same population, children's population being affected by that same, problem and not having class, cases or not being able to change that. So the question is, what do we do here? We can identify and sanction a violation, but we do not necessarily dismantle the system that keeps Romani children apart. Beyond litigation, and I'll just add two more sentences here, in the book I also talk about major European policy efforts, so not only legal steps, but also policy efforts that have approached education from a similar liberal behavioral approach. So what we see, for instance, in the 2011 European Union Roma framework, which was adopted and adjusted to every member state of the EU, is that education has always been a key area of intervention. But what happens in these frameworks, in these strategies and plans is that most often they target Romani children. So they want to improve the school participation. They want to have Romani parents involved in school matters, but most often these plans do not target racism. So 9 out of 10 Romani children participate in primary education today, but in some countries, 50 or 70% of them are in separated schools or classes or even special schools. And the quality of education is very poor in those environments. So the question is, how do we move a little bit beyond this idea of educating, integrating, including Romani people in a system that is profoundly racist and has been racist for a long time. So essentially, the responsibility is shifted in this framework. So instead of asking why educational institutions continue to produce segregated outcomes, the liberal framework asks how Romani children can be brought into schools more effectively, how Romani parents can be better informed, or how Romani neighborhoods and villages can be encouraged to comply to the existing system. So I think that, if you were to go 10 years later after 2011 and look at the EU strategy in 2021, in relation to segregation, they aim to reduce segregation by 50%. That would be amazing, particularly because segregation is increasing. But one of the questions that I asked in the book is, what happens to the other half? So Europe knows that this other half would remain behind, so how do you ensure remedies, and how do you improve the lives of a new generation of children who are there in front of us, and we are not able to address their human rights and to make them part of a society that is not only equal on paper and equitable in intent, but also just it has to be just in practice. And I'll stop here.
Thank you. I want to come back to this question of remedies and how we can think about dismantling these racialized systems. But one of the things that I think has come through so strongly in your talk just now, and that also is a recurring theme in the book, is the emphasis on how anti-Roma racism really is structural in nature. And so I wonder if you could maybe unpack for us a little bit further how you see the role of law and legal institutions in particular in not only failing to protect Roma people from racism and in the context of discrimination actions, but also in affirmatively instituting, legitimizing, enabling racism. And of course, you pointed to this through your talk, but I just wonder if we could hear a little bit more about that, and also to what extent that you're still seeing that be the case today as opposed to a more historical practice.
Yeah, that's a big question. So one thing that I would say is that my belief, you don't have to take it for granted, is that structural problems require structural solutions, and many people have said this before, so don't quote me on it because it's not me. But I think that what I see problematic is the fact that all policies and laws in Europe expect Roma, as well as other racialized groups, different genders, different people with different abilities, to really adapt to institutions that have never been constructed and designed for them, and for us in the case of Romani people. And these are not just institutions, these are the spaces we are in, our cultures, arts, representation, power resources, and everything else. So nothing really belongs to us, but we are expected to fit in a racist system, and that has not worked for a long time. So if you want to think about a step forward, I think that one piece that we can think of, and is not necessarily the start, is really the level of analysis. So what if we, take this critical approach to our legal systems to our policies. And I think that many scholars who have been here at the law school have thought about, critical approaches to law. And what if, we change the level of analysis from treating, in our case, anti-Roma injustices as primarily a series of, isolated incidents, to actually treating these incidents and human rights violations as part of a structure, of a technology that has been built for more than 700 years now. So I think that the level of analysis, once we have a shift there in Europe, that might be, met with different ways of thinking about policy and lawmaking. Now, I think that to a large extent, and I talk about this in the book, when the idea of racism and the theories of racism were developed in Europe in the early 1930s, European scholars started from the premises that racism is a result of the theories of races, which were developed in the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe. So they were saying, like these so-called scientists were saying that we have 4 or 5 races and there is a hierarchy, and for some reasons, white Europeans found themselves at the top of the hierarchy. And then you see a wave of fascism and Nazism in Europe, and therefore several scholars start to think about defining racism, and they define racism based on these 2 ideas. So you have theory, ideology, and ideology at the same time. So the response in that framework is that if people are racist, but our liberal system is just, so what we need to do is to make sure that we create awareness, that we educate, that we have diversity programs, which we don't have anymore at Harvard. But, even that. But so that's the response. And the response is also taken in the United States, so that is borrowed. And many of the, the measures that were imagined by anti-racists in the US came from that place. In parallel with this liberal theory of racism, you have a whole structural approach that comes from Du Bois, but also more so from the Caribbean anti-colonial scholars. I'm thinking about Frantz Fanon, I'm thinking of Mrs. Zare, Anton Kom, and others. And they say, well, what Europeans are missing here is the fact that prior to the theories of race, prior to the Holocaust, there had been a long process of colonialism and a long process of violence against other populations. So you cannot really look at these new phenomena in Europe without considering the global system in which Europeans have actually put a lot of violence in. So these anti-colonial scholars invite us to look at racism from a structural perspective, and from there, this whole idea of a structural problem requires structural solutions. And there are different ways to look at it. M.S. Zare proposes a cultural revolution, and Fanon says we need a new way, a new world. How would that new world look like? I think that it's up for us all to imagine it, and imagine it also in a moment in our own realities and history today, when we see that internationalism, as we hoped to keep working, doesn't work as much. If you look at the some of the recommendations or the decisions of the United Nations, the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice. So there is a question mark on our own frameworks, and then probably this is a moment when, after the Second World War, we were able to imagine something better. So probably we will all have to imagine something that is more courageous. And it may be a new world, but a world that doesn't rely only on individualism, but relies also on the idea that we live in neighborhoods, in communities, and many of our problems are not just present-day problems, but they come with a history and they continue.
Thank you for that context. I want to open it up to the audience momentarily, but if I may just ask one more question. So understanding that what is needed is truly a more aggressive rupture of the system and a reimagining of what the world can look like, do you see a role at all for legal strategies in this process? And I was struck by this one line in your book that I think was in a slightly different context as it relates to bodily violence and torture, which is one of the ways that anti-Roma racism manifests that you point to in the book, where you say that there's a truth-related and moral need for a careful and honest examination, acknowledgement and reckoning with the institutionalization and normalization of bodily violence, especially torture, with a focus on the who, why, and how behind that level of brutality. And it reminded me of transitional justice contexts where processes are engaged that are maybe quasi-legal in nature, where there are attempts to get at some of these broader systemic issues and a revelation of truth that really points to all of the factors within the system that led to different kinds of brutality. And so I wonder both how you see the role for legal strategies, but also if there's a way that we can learn from other contexts and imagine a process, if you will, that gets at remedies that are also trying to speak not only to the individual harms that people may have suffered, but really speaks to the broader system.
So let me first say that in the book, I look at bodily violence as an underpinning or a protector of anti-Roma racism, and essentially in theorizing it, I go back in the history and come until present day and see how this violence has been manifested. I talk about repressive violence, particularly looking at killings and the so-called gypsy hunts in various moments in time. I look at the enslaved Romani people who are trying to escape, and they were killed or beaten up or punished. But I also look at communal violence, and here I build on the work of some Polish Jewish scholars who look at neighborhood violence. And the whole question there is, well, how is it possible for neighbors who have been here for a long time to all of a sudden become so violent? So in my case, I look at communal violence against Romani people. So I'm talking about houses put on fire, people expelled from their neighborhoods and all that. And these are recent cases. Some of them I actually monitored in my human rights work back in Romania in 2009 and 2011. And then I look at institutional or organized violence, and here I talk a lot about police killings, police violence, but also other forms, more subtle forms of violence that is institutionalized. So I think for me the question, particularly because in the book I talk about genocides, and not only in relation to the Holocaust, but I talk about Spain. I look at forced sterilization from that perspective of the new laws regarding and new definitions regarding genocide. So in the book I really try to follow a little bit the steps of many Latin American scholars who are trying to push a little bit the limits of scholarship, where you see the oppressed as the object of research. So what if we shift a little bit and we think about the oppressed as subject, and then therefore you ask, why is it that violence is instituted upon you, and therefore who is the institution or the person responsible for that violence, and how do we actually shift the gear and we ask, white Europeans, so why are you doing this? Why don't we do research in these communities where you have so much communal violence, and just understand violence as opposed to understanding only those who are the victims of violence? And I know that in Latin America, in the Americas, more broadly, and in other places of the world, these questions have been asked, but for some reasons Europeans have not asked them in that particular context. I think there is room for legislation to become better. I think that the right to remedy has to become a reality that focuses a little bit more on collective injustices, We don't have that yet in Europe. I know that the United Nations has a whole, framework for the right remedy, but that doesn't exist in spaces, particularly in relation to historical injustice. And you know legislation much better than me. So that's part of it. You cannot address past injustices. And the second part is it's somehow that we don't have class action in Europe, so you cannot have, a huge, a large amount of people filing a complaint, and more so the European legislation in my understanding as a political scientist, is that they do not focus on financial compensations as much as courts in the US would. So the compensations are usually very small, but the idea is that you point out to the harm and less to the compensation, but you can suggest policy changes. So there are ways to do so, but I think that many of us are trying to push a little bit the limits of the law, and in many ways we've done it, because this is a different topic, but in European legislation, race, it's a question mark, and racial discrimination is really also how do you really identify races in a region that doesn't recognize race, if you think about France or Greece. So that's an additional caveat there to keep in mind. But we've managed, for instance, at the European Court of Human Rights, and this is one of my colleagues at one organization in Romania, to recognize racial profiling as a manifestation of discrimination that targets Romani people. So that was, huge, but not enough.
Thank you. With that, questions from the audience?
Thank you very much for your speaking. I have a question. My understanding of school segregation is mostly based in Bulgaria, but I think this is true for a lot of Eastern Europe, is that over the past 30 years, as liberalism has kind of developed as a project in Eastern Europe, a lot of the work being done to remedy school segregation and to integrate Roma students isn't happening by the state, but is happening by private actors and NGOs. And I'm wondering, as you're talking about making structural changes, how do you see the role of the state versus the private NGO changing? And what are your thoughts on this development?
Thank you so much. And I would love to talk to you about Bulgaria, particularly because Bulgaria is, I think, the first country in the region that started through NGOs to address the issue of school segregation, and not only through legislation, but more so through busing. So for many years, the United States model of desegregation has served as a model for Europeans in that sense. I think that many Romani activists, advocates, leaders in Eastern and Central Europe have always asked themselves, why are we actually, replacing the state in doing this work? And I think sometimes people are more strategic than other times. So one path that many have taken was to pilot an initiative, being it busing or being it desegregation through, randomly mixing children. So there have been many strategies, but the idea was that you pilot it and then probably you can convince the state to scale it up. So that was, more strategic. Other times, if you are a local advocate, you just want to solve the problem now, not to think only, in the future, more structurally and more nationally, if you will. But I think that through strategic litigation, through busing, through initiatives at the local level, many NGOs and activists have managed to push a little bit the agenda, and many of them have participated in creating anti-discrimination laws. But this is a moment when you have many policy windows, because these countries, including Bulgaria, was aiming to enter the European Union, and there were some very strong criteria regarding discrimination. So I think there were some policy windows when activists have tried and have succeeded to push a little bit the agenda forward. But once again, these are small pockets, and the system itself has never been challenged. And to a large extent, many of my fellow activists and scholars are strong believers of the system as it is.
Thank you very much. This is really, really interesting. I was just wondering, my experience is very limited to like the Slovak Republic, but a lot of conversations I had there were kind of going to what you were saying about people thinking that like race was an issue in America, but not something that Europeans had to worry about at all. But then that would also be tied with very visible housing segregation. I was wondering how much you think public perceptions need to change in order for long-term like change to be effective, or do you think that it's something that can come more from the government and that'll achieve the same results?
So these are two schools of thought. I follow more the top-down approach in this one, although my work is very much bottom-up in many other matters. And I think that for law students, this might be easier to understand. For me, what you feel, what you think, how many biases you may have can stay in place as long as you follow the laws, and the laws are just. So I add that caveat in the conversation as well. So for me, it's more how do you change the system, and then I think it's once you have power redistribution, once you have redistribution of resources, remedies, and representation that is fair, then I think there is much more room to think about a different world rather than just changing minds and solve. So, and it's not an either-or paradigm. I don't believe in that either. So I think you can definitely go both ways at the same time, but I think that the focus has to be on structural change. Now, on your point about Slovakia and Europeans not being able to see race, I think that I operate with that, that question quite a bit in the book, and I don't use race as a category in the book. On the contrary, I use racialization as a process, and I look at the ways in which it is formed. And I think that in the book I looked at, a phenotype as a big, category which is often, essentialized but also hierarchized. But in the case of the Romani people, and you may have seen this in Slovakia and also in Bulgaria, there are so many differences. We don't necessarily all look the same, but there is another layer to it. So the history of your family, the village where you come from, your last name, the way that you dress, the languages that you speak. So all that will help you understand if someone around you is Roma or not, and then you racialize them. Racialization is not just about categorization and hierarchization. It also includes what I call in the book myth crafting. So the idea of Roma criminality, the idea of Roma laziness, the idea of a population as a contagious group, all these are not just biases and prejudices, in my opinion. They are really, myths that help us justify the system we are in. In the book, I also talk about relational racialization, and where I say that, I really mean, processes where two racialized groups. In the book, I talk about Romani people and Jewish people, and then Romani people and Black people. One racialized group is compared to the other so that the negative elements that have been constructed against one group will be also transferred to the other. Romani people have never been mentioned in the theories of race in the 18th and 19th centuries. But if you look at the literature coming during that period, Romani people are always called Africans. They are always called Ethiopians, which in the language of Aristotelian language meant Africans, but more so it meant burnt faces. So it's always a process of racialization there. And I look at Romani people and Jewish people as contagion, but also plague and so much more. And then finally, I look at racialization through the lenses of absolute dehumanization, which is basically enslavement when you become property, objects, and currency rather than a human being. So you are a non-human. Your humanness is taken away. So I do, operate with the European frameworks by, trying to unpack them in a way that is probably easier for Europeans to understand, so that they see that, well, it's not the United States, but at the same time, races have been very much the conception of Europeans. So we have to take that back. Racism has been invented as a practice, as a technology of power and oppression by Europeans. So it's not American in any shape and form. I say it's now American, but it was invented by Europeans.
Two more questions, yeah.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I have two questions. One is related to school segregation. I was wondering whether in the Romani community or the Romani rights organization there is a movement that would support cultural autonomy for Romani people. So schools for Romani people not as a form of segregation, but rather as a form of cultural self-determination and the right to the mother tongue. And my other question is related to historical sources. When writing the history of Romani people, the sources often reflect the perspective of the state and of the perpetrators. And anti-Roma racism is often masked as social policy. And I was wondering, how do you go about this when you work with such sources? How do you disentangle the racial from the social, for example, in cases when racism is not verbalized? For example, when a child is separated from their parents because allegedly they are not able to take care of them, and the state is allegedly more able to do that. So, is it possible to disentangle the racist and the social element?
Thank you so much. These are big questions too, but I will probably start with the one about racism and social issues. I think that even when I look at poverty as an issue, I'm pretty sure that 80% of Romani people in Europe face poverty, but in some of my work, I argue that you cannot disconnect racism from poverty. So we are talking about racialized poverty in the case of Romani people, and more so in Europe, we haven't been able to yet measure wealth. So if in the US, I think that Sandy Darity and Mary Bassett and others have looked at wealth and its relationship with health and other major indicators, but in Europe, we haven't done that. But if you were to think about income as a small piece of wealth, I think that the disparities are even higher, particularly in countries that have long been spaces of oppression. In Romania, Romani people were freed from slavery in 1856. So until then, they had been property. In this period, there has never been a project of repair, a project of healing. So therefore, wealth, it's really a big question mark there. So I talk about racialized poverty, but I think that applies also to the case of child-family separation that you mentioned. This is a big problem in many European countries, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, the UK. Many European countries would basically separate Romani families from their children, and the biggest argument is poverty. Now, I guess with you, I don't even dare to say much, but I think that the Convention of Children's Rights, is very specific about poverty and how that may not be an enough reason to actually separate families, but it's weaponized against Romani families and children. One of the courts in Hungary has actually had a decision maybe 2 years ago, a domestic court, that said that this is discrimination. And our colleagues from the European Roma Rights Center, this is a regional human rights organization, have worked a lot in Bulgaria. And they have been more creative in terms of using law and legislation. So they have used research to actually show this, disproportional removal of Romani children from their parents. So I think it's, in present day, if you think about racism and poverty, I think they are very much connected. But if you were to look back at historical sources, and that leads me to the first part of your comment, indeed, all historical sources that we have are written by non-Roma people. Now, not only that, but if you think about the work of Trouillot, well-known Haitian historian, he asks who makes the archive, who writes history, and all that. And in our case, none of that is Romani people. But what I do in my book, and I try to do in my work, is on one hand to look at the archives myself. So I engage with white European scholarship, but at the same time, I go back to the initial sources and also take that, to a critical lens. But at the same time, it's not hard. Someone asked me maybe a week ago about, critical theory in Romani studies and when did it start? And I'm like, I think in the 1800s. And it was because if you look at the archives, there are Romani enslaved people who write letters complaining about their, enslavers. And they say, well, we don't want to be called gypsies. We'd rather be called thieves. And there are many, comments that are like so, theoretically profound. So I don't think that, I bring something like so spectacular in the literature. I just look at these archives and easily anyone can actually say this is very racist. And this is what I essentially do. Now, school segregation, cultural self-determination and language, that's a beautiful topic. In Romania, when I was the director of Romani Cris, a Roma rights organization, we are partners with Amare Romența, an organization working on cultural rights and language. And very often we'd be in this space when we would think, is this school segregated? Is this school, that if the community is residentially segregated and they want to be in that school and they have good, education and they learn Romani language and the professors, the teachers are Romani, so what do you do about that? And I think that this has always been back and forth. I think that we can always, go back again to the US and look at some, models that may work or not. But I also read Segronomics, so there is the economy of that there as well. So I'm aware of it. I think that for me, Romani schools that are created by, with the voice of Romani families and with children, but this is not coercion, or this is not the easy way to go to, then those are beautiful. So I do want us to be able to, to continue thinking about language and history and all that, but I think that most often these are very, exceptional cases. Segregation is really a matter that comes from institutions, from white neighbors and parents and all that. So it's a beautiful project. I think we can, have a few schools like that, but it has to be with a lot of agency and power from the local community.
I think we have time for one last question.
Thank you so much for coming. This has been really interesting. My family's from Iași.
Oh, hi. That's Romania. So my excitement is she's from my own country.
I was actually in Romania last year during Călin Georgescu's campaign, and in general. I'm concerned about the rise of far-right politics in that part of the world and this part of the world as well. So my question is, how do you position this need for systemic change in sort of the current political moment?
I spend quite a bit of time in Romania as well, and also in other countries. And most often when I go home, I spend my time in the village with my mom, where I grew up. And I think that many of my neighbors, some of my relatives, are supporters of these far-right parties. And it's scary, right, in so many ways. But because these are people that I've loved for a long time, and I also like to talk with my people a lot, then I ask what's the reason, and very often is frustration, and very often is this feeling that there is a systemic disinvestment in their communities and their needs and all that. And I think this is the space where far right and not only all these extremist views come into these places, because there is frustration, there is a need for change, and people find that as a go-to. Of course, this is, theoretically, that's not the only explanation, right? And I don't want us to go there. This is some of the experiences that I see in my own village and in my own families. So they have real needs, they have real problems that they have, been expected to end for 30 years, right, since the end of the dictatorial regime. So I do think that that's very scary, and more so, I have to say that I was surprised because I've always seen Romania as a space that would not really, get into this nationalistic, some, very fascist, approaches. But this is where we are for many reasons. I think that it is precisely in moments of crisis that we need to think about systemic change. Because if we bring another Band-Aid now, it may help on short term, but we will find ourselves at the bottom pretty soon again. So for me, systemic change is really the path forward in ensuring that we don't allow this, this kind of approaches to get into our neighborhoods, in our families, and so on.
Thank you. What a beautiful note to end on. And I just wanted to once again, highly recommend the book for everyone in this room who are interested in these topics. I think one of the things that is so powerful about the way that you approach these issues, Magda, is both the comprehensiveness and depth of examination across contexts and across time, that you pull on these themes and really paint a vivid picture of just the extent to which anti-Roma racism is a pervasive problem that I think we all have a moral duty to confront. But throughout the book, you also weave in this personal narrative and place yourself in the story. And I imagine that it hasn't been an easy process to write this. I guess just as we end, I would invite you to share if there's maybe one thing that you hope that people take away from the book, and I think maybe especially Gajo allies, if you will, right? So non-Roma who are interested in these, in playing some small part in countering this. What do you hope that we take from the book?
So I think that the book was written primarily for Romani people, and I think that the message there is really don't believe that you are inferior. Don't believe what the Gajikane world tells you, what the white tells you that you are. You are beautiful, you are smart, you are human. But I think that for allies and everyone out there, I think that what I hope is really to ask yourself or to ask others whenever someone says something about Romani people that would justify a violation of rights or racism through the language of behavior, culture, and lifestyle. I just hope you question them, because there is no group out there in the world, no population that has a single behavior, you know, a culture that is fixed and nothing can justify violence and oppression.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking you.
Thank you so much, Bea, and thank you all for coming.